Blood tastes like pennies and bad decisions. You learn that fast when you drop a man who owns half the city's underground. He laughed. That was the worst part. He lay there on the sticky linoleum of a dead-end diner, bleeding from the jaw, and he just laughed, a wet, rattling sound. This isn't a fairy tale where the beast changes for the beauty. It's the story of a girl who had nothing left to lose, and a man who decided to take her anyway. Grease has a way of sinking into your pores, settling somewhere beneath the epidermis, so that no matter how hard you scrub with the cheap, pink soap in the employee bathroom, you still smell like Tuesday's fries. Harper knew this. She had accepted it. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with the buzzing fluorescent tube flickering above the pie case. It was 2:14 a.m. The diner, an aluminum-sided relic dumped on the edge of the industrial district, was a purgatory for third-shift workers, insomniacs, and people who had nowhere better to be. Harper dragged a damp, grey rag across the speckled formica counter. The rag smelled of old milk and industrial bleach. She wiped up a ring of dried coffee, pressing her weight down onto her wrists, feeling the subtle pop of a joint in her thumb. Her feet were swollen in her cheap, slip-resistant shoes. They felt like 2 blocks of lead wrapped in damp cotton. Rain lashed against the plate-glass windows, distorting the yellow streetlights outside into smeared halos. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, high-pitched jingle that felt aggressively out of place in the middle of the night. Harper didn't look up immediately. She swept a handful of toast crumbs into her palm, tossed them into the trash bin under the counter, and wiped her hands on her apron. When she finally raised her eyes, the air in the diner had already shifted. You could feel it in your teeth. 3 men stood in the entryway, tracking mud onto the grey and white checkered tiles Harper had mopped an hour ago. 2 of them were massive, built like brick walls draped in damp wool coats. They had the flat, dead eyes of men who were paid to stand still and hurt people. But it was the man in the center who sucked the oxygen out of the room. He wasn't exceptionally tall, maybe 6'1", but he occupied space like a gravitational anomaly. His charcoal suit was dry, completely untouched by the torrential downpour outside. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, peeling off leather gloves finger by finger. The faint smell of ozone and expensive cedar cologne cut through the diner's heavy stench of burnt coffee. Harper felt a prickle of sweat at the base of her neck. Survival instinct, primitive and sharp, told her to walk into the kitchen and let Arturo, the line cook, handle this. But Arturo was currently asleep on a sack of onions near the walk-in freezer, and Harper needed this job to pay her brother's tuition. "Booth or counter?" Harper said. Her voice was flat, carrying the gravel of a 10-hour shift. The man in the center paused. His eyes, a pale, washed-out grey, like dirty winter ice, locked onto hers. He didn't smile, but a subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth suggested he found her existence mildly amusing. "Counter," he said. His voice was smooth, dark, rolling like velvet over broken glass. He walked forward, the 2 human mountains trailing a few paces behind. He sat on a red vinyl stool directly in front of her. The stool squeaked in protest. He placed his hands on the counter. His nails were impeccably manicured. A heavy gold watch peeked out from beneath the cuff of his crisp white shirt. "Coffee," he said, not looking at a menu. "Black. Whatever is freshest." Harper grabbed a ceramic mug, thick and heavy, and turned to the glass pot sitting on the burner. The coffee inside was black sludge, having sat there since midnight. She didn't care. She poured it, the dark liquid steaming violently as it hit the cold mug. She set it down in front of him. A drop splashed onto the formica. He stared at the drop. Then he stared at her. "I said fresh." "It's 2 a.m., Harper replied, leaning against the back counter, crossing her arms over her chest to hide the slight tremor in her hands. "That's as fresh as it gets until the morning cook comes in at 5. Drink it or don't." One of the bodyguards shifted, his hand drifting casually toward the inside of his coat. A metallic clink echoed softly in the quiet diner. Harper's stomach bottomed out, cold dread flooding her veins, but she kept her face blank. "Show them fear, and they eat you." The man raised a hand, stopping his guard without looking. He picked up the mug, brought it to his lips, and took a slow sip. His face remained perfectly impassive. He swallowed. "Tastes like battery acid," he murmured, placing the mug back down. "It's an acquired taste," Harper shot back, immediately regretting it. Her mouth had always been her worst enemy, firing off before her brain could calculate the risk. He tilted his head, studying her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hiss of the rain and the hum of the refrigerator. He wasn't looking at her like a person. He was looking at her the way a mechanic looks at a broken engine part, trying to figure out if it's worth fixing or throwing away. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "None of your business." A low chuckle vibrated in his chest. "Feisty. You must be tired, little bird, working in a dump like this, serving battery acid to strangers." "I was fine until about 3 minutes ago," Harper said. She grabbed her rag and started wiping the counter down again, 3 feet away from him, avoiding his gaze. The coarse texture of the rag grounded her. He leaned forward, invading her space. She could smell the mint on his breath, undercutting the cedar. "Do you know who I am?" "No," Harper lied. She had seen his face on the local news, usually walking out of a courthouse surrounded by lawyers. Roman. Something Italian. A man who owned shipping companies that didn't ship anything legal. "I think you do," Roman whispered. He reached out and tapped the rim of the coffee mug. "I think you know exactly who I am, and you're trying very hard to act like you don't care. It's a good act. But your pulse is fluttering." He pointed a long, pale finger at the hollow of her throat. Harper instinctively touched her neck. Her skin was burning. She felt exposed, stripped down to her nerves under his dead ice stare. "Are you going to order food, or are you just here to critique the coffee and analyze my vital signs?" Roman smiled. It was a cold, terrifying thing. "Neither. I'm just waiting for the rain to stop." 40 minutes passed. The diner remained completely empty, save for Roman and his 2 gargoyles. Harper stayed busy, aggressively refilling salt shakers and wiping down syrup bottles, trying to ignore the weight of his stare burning a hole between her shoulder blades. He hadn't touched his coffee again. He just sat there, occasionally checking his watch, watching her work with an unblinking, predatory focus. It was maddening. Harper's exhaustion was curdling into a hot, tight knot of anger behind her ribs. At 3 a.m., she finally snapped. She walked over, grabbed the cold mug of coffee, and dumped it into the sink. She tossed the mug into the dish rack with a loud clatter. "We're closing the dining area," Harper lied, her voice tight. "You need to leave." Roman didn't move. He rested his elbows on the counter, steepling his fingers. "Your sign says open 24 hours. The sign is wrong. Get out." The 2 guards immediately stepped forward, their massive frames casting long, menacing shadows across the floor. Harper's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she planted her feet on the sticky floor. Roman held up a finger. The guard stopped. He stood up, slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket. He towered over her, the physical difference between them sudden and stark. Harper had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a sleek, black leather wallet, and extracted a crisp $100 bill. He didn't hand it to her. He held it over the counter, right above a puddle of spilled water. He let it go. The bill fluttered down, landing in the dirty puddle, immediately soaking up the grime. "For the coffee," Roman said softly. "Pick it up." Harper stared at the ruined money. $100. That was 2 shifts. That was the electric bill. A spike of raw, humiliating desperation pierced her chest, followed instantly by a wave of furious, blinding pride. She looked up at him. His eyes were mocking, waiting for her to bend. He wanted to see her grovel. He was bored, and breaking a tired waitress was his midnight entertainment. "Pick it up yourself," Harper spat. Roman sighed, a sound of exaggerated disappointment. "You're making this difficult. People usually do what I tell them. I'm not your people." He leaned over the counter, invading her space again. So close she could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. "You're nobody. You're a girl in a dirty apron working a dead-end job. Don't play tough with me. You're not built for it." "Back off," Harper warned, her voice dropping an octave. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She hadn't been in a fight since she was 17, brawling in the alley behind her high school. But muscle memory is a stubborn thing. Roman scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "Think you're tough? Prove it." He tapped his own jaw with a mocking finger. "Come on, hit me. Let's see what that mouth can back up." It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a reflex born of exhaustion, humiliation, and the absolute certainty that this man had never been told no in his miserable, pampered, violent life. Harper didn't throw a punch. A punch breaks knuckles. She stepped into the counter, pivoting on her left foot, driving her hips forward, and slammed the heel of her open palm directly upward into Roman's jaw. Crack! The sound was horrifyingly loud in the quiet diner, meat and bone colliding with terrible velocity. The shockwave shot up Harper's arm, jarring her shoulder, a painful electric jolt. Roman's head snapped back. He hadn't expected it. He hadn't braced. His slick leather shoes lost traction on the wet floor. He stumbled backward, his arms flailing for a second. And then he went down. Hard. The back of his skull hit the edge of a booth table on the way down with a sickening thud, and he crumpled onto the linoleum, a heap of expensive cashmere and sudden, terrifying stillness. Silence slammed into the room. Harper stood frozen, her chest heaving, the heel of her hand throbbing with a hot, burning pain. She stared down at the body on the floor. Oh God, she thought, the adrenaline washing out of her, leaving behind cold, paralyzing terror. I just killed him. I just killed a Mafia boss in a diner. One of the bodyguards yelled something incomprehensible. The sound of a gun being drawn, the heavy metallic scrape of steel against a holster, echoed like a cannon shot. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bullet. Wait. The voice was a harsh, wet rasp. Harper opened her eyes. Roman was moving. He rolled onto his side, coughing. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the checkered floor. It was bright red against the dirty white tile. He touched his jaw, his fingers coming away stained with blood. He looked at his fingers. Then, incredibly, he started to laugh. It was a dark, broken sound that scraped against the walls of the diner. He looked up at her, his eyes wild, no longer dead ice, but burning with a sudden, manic heat. "Well," Roman wheezed, wiping blood from his chin with the back of his expensive jacket sleeve. "I'll be damned." The world seemed to operate on a lag. Harper watched the blood drip from Roman's chin, hitting the floor with tiny rhythmic splats. Her palm throbbed, a steady, localized heartbeat. She couldn't breathe. The air in the diner felt thick, laced with the sharp, metallic tang of blood and the sour stench of her own panic. Boss. The larger of the two guards, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stepped forward. His gun was drawn, leveled directly at Harper's chest. The black hole of the barrel looked enormous. "Put it away, Arthur," Roman commanded. He didn't yell, but the authority in his gravelly voice was absolute. Arthur hesitated, his eyes locked on Harper with lethal intent. "She assaulted you." "She surprised me," Roman corrected. He grabbed the edge of a booth and hauled himself to his feet. He swayed for a fraction of a second before locking his knees. He touched the back of his head, wincing as his fingers met a swelling knot. He looked at Harper again. There was no anger in his face, only a deep, terrifying fascination. "I told her to prove it," Roman said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. And she did. Harper backed up, her spine hitting the stainless steel refrigerator behind the counter. The cold metal seeped through her thin uniform shirt. I want you to leave," she stammered, hating the wobble in her voice. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard now. Her knees felt like water. Roman ignored her request. He took a step closer to the counter, leaning over it, unbothered by the fact that she had just knocked him unconscious a moment ago. "You have a hell of a right hand, little bird," he murmured. He tasted the blood on his lip and smiled, a gruesome, red-stained expression. "You're coming with me." Harper blinked. The words didn't compute. "What?" "Grab her," Roman said to Arthur, turning toward the door. It happened too fast to fight. Arthur vaulted the counter with terrifying agility for a man his size. Harper lunged for a heavy cast-iron skillet hanging above the stove, but Arthur's hand closed around her bicep like an industrial vice. Pain flared through her arm, numbing her fingers instantly. "Hey!" Harper screamed, kicking backward, her slip-resistant shoe connecting with Arthur's shin. He didn't even flinch. He hauled her backward, easily lifting her off her feet. "Let me go! Arturo! Help!" she shrieked, thrashing wildly. In the back, Arturo stirred on his sack of onions, mumbled something in Spanish, and rolled over. Arthur marched her around the counter, dragging her toward the front door. The second guard opened the glass door, letting the roaring wind and rain sweep into the diner. "You can't do this!" Harper yelled, clawing at Arthur's thick, meaty hand. It was like trying to pry off a steel bracket. "This is kidnapping." Roman, standing just outside the door under the meager awning, looked back at her. He wiped the last of the blood from his chin. "I don't care." They dragged her out into the storm. The cold rain hit Harper like a slap in the face, instantly soaking through her thin cotton uniform. The wind howled, drowning out her screams. The industrial street was completely deserted. No cars, no pedestrians, just endless rows of darkened warehouses and the glowing red tail lights of a massive black SUV idling at the curb. Arthur shoved her forward. She stumbled over the wet pavement, her knees scraping against the rough asphalt. Before she could push herself up, the second guard grabbed her by the back of her apron and threw her into the back seat of the SUV. Harper landed hard on lush, butter-soft leather. The contrast was dizzying, from the sticky, foul-smelling diner to the immaculate, climate-controlled interior of the vehicle. It smelled like new car, expensive leather, and that pervasive, terrifying cedar cologne. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the far door, frantically pulling the handle. It was dead. Child locks. The heavy doors slammed shut behind her, sealing out the sound of the rain. The silence inside the cabin was immediate and suffocating. The driver, a silent ghost in a sharp suit, put the car in gear. The locks engaged with a heavy, final thunk. Roman climbed into the passenger seat up front. He adjusted the rearview mirror so he could look at her. His face was pale in the dim streetlights, the bruising on his jaw already starting to purple. Harper huddled in the corner, shivering violently from the wet clothes and the sheer, unadulterated terror. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was trapped in a moving steel cage with men who killed people for a living, because she had lost her temper over a cup of coffee. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered. Her throat felt raw. Roman watched her in the mirror for a long moment. He reached up and gently touched his swollen jaw again. "Home," he said softly. The SUV peeled away from the curb, its heavy tires hissing against the wet asphalt, leaving the flickering neon sign of the diner to buzz to an empty room. Harper squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers, knowing with a cold, absolute certainty that her life had just violently, irreversibly derailed. The SUV's suspension swallowed the potholes of the city, turning the chaotic streets into a smooth, silent film playing outside the tinted windows. Harper's panic had plateaued into a dull, vibrating hum in her teeth. The heater in the floorboards blew warm, dry air against her damp ankles. She smelled wet wool, the rich musk of the leather seats, and the lingering copper scent of the blood Roman had spat onto the diner floor. They drove for nearly an hour. The neon signs and crumbling brick of the industrial district gave way to the manicured, lifeless sprawl of the wealthy suburbs, and then higher, up a winding road flanked by dense, black pines. Harper didn't ask questions. Asking questions implied a conversation, and a conversation implied she accepted this new, terrifying reality. She just stared at the back of Roman's headrest. He hadn't spoken a word since telling the driver to take them home. He just sat there, occasionally pressing a folded white handkerchief to his jaw. The car slowed. Massive wrought-iron gates materialized out of the rain, parting silently as the SUV approached. The tires crunched over perfectly raked gravel, a sound that felt obscenely loud in the dead of night. They pulled up to a house that looked less like a home and more like a modern art museum. It was all brutalist concrete, sharp angles, and massive panes of dark glass. No welcoming porch lights, just security cameras mounted under the eaves, their small red LEDs cutting through the gloom like watchful eyes. The driver killed the engine. The silence rushed back in. Arthur opened her door. The cold air hit her again, but the rain had reduced to a heavy drizzle. "Out!" Arthur grunted. Harper didn't move. Her fingers gripped the edge of the leather seat. "No." Arthur sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. He didn't argue. He just reached in, grabbed her by the upper arm and hauled her out. Her slip-resistant shoes hit the wet gravel. She stumbled, her knees jarring, but Arthur kept her upright, dragging her toward the heavy oak front door. Roman was already inside. The foyer was vast, smelling of floor wax and cold stone. The lighting was dim, casting long, sharp shadows across a floor of imported grey slate. It didn't look lived in. There were no coats on a rack, no shoes by the door. It looked like a place where people waited to die. "Second floor, the East guest room," Roman said. He didn't look back at her. He was shrugging off his wet jacket, handing it to a man who had appeared silently from a side hallway. "You can't keep me here," Harper said. Her voice cracked, betraying the terror she was trying so hard to swallow. "I have a brother. He expects me home at 6. When I don't show up, he'll call the police." Roman paused. He turned slowly. Under the harsh track lighting of the foyer, the damage to his face was fully visible. The right side of his jaw was swollen, an angry, mottled plum color spreading toward his earlobe. His lip was split, a dark scab forming in the corner. He didn't look angry. He looked intensely, clinically curious. The police, Roman repeated, testing the word like it was a foreign concept. Let them come, little bird. I own the precinct captain. I own the dispatcher who will take the call. If your brother reports you missing, the file will accidentally be dropped behind a filing cabinet. The absolute certainty in his voice stripped the air from Harper's lungs. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, heavy stone of despair. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I hit you? Kill me and get it over with." Roman's washed-out grey eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes silent on the slate. "Kill you? Why would I destroy the only interesting thing that has happened to me in 5 years?" He tilted his head. "Arthur, put her in the room. Lock the door. If she breaks anything, take it out of her pay." Harper didn't have the energy to ask what pay he was talking about. Arthur marched her up a floating glass staircase. The house was cavernous, echoing with the soft thud of their footsteps. He shoved her into a room at the end of a long, sterile hallway and pulled the door shut. The lock turned with a heavy, industrial clack. Harper stood in the dark. She reached out, feeling along the wall until her hand brushed a switch. Soft, ambient light flooded the space. It was a bedroom, but it looked like a high-end hotel suite. A massive bed with crisp white linens, minimalist furniture, a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the dark, rain-swept pines. She walked to the door and jiggled the handle, solid. She walked to the window and felt for a latch, sealed shut, tempered glass. She was trapped. Harper sank to the floor at the foot of the bed, her cheap, grease-stained uniform starkly out of place against the plush wool rug. The adrenaline finally evaporated, leaving her hollow and shaking. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her arms, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to cry. When the 2 minutes were up, she wiped her face on her rough apron, leaving a streak of mascara and diner grease. Crying wouldn't pay her brother's tuition. Crying wouldn't pick the lock on the heavy oak door. She sat on the floor, staring at the locked handle, and began to wait. Time lost its meaning in the windowless, sealed environment. Harper watched the sky outside shift from black to a bruised, watery grey. Morning. Her stomach cramped, a sharp reminder that she hadn't eaten since a handful of cold fries at midnight. Her right hand throbbed in time with her pulse, the heel of her palm a patchwork of yellow and purple bruising. At exactly 9 a.m., the deadbolt clicked. Harper scrambled to her feet, backing away until her shoulders hit the cool glass of the window. The door opened. It wasn't Arthur. It was Roman. He had changed. He wore dark slacks and a black cashmere sweater that made his pale skin look almost translucent. The swelling on his jaw had localized into a hard, vivid knot. He carried a silver tray in one hand. He nudged the door shut behind him with his foot and set the tray down on a low glass table. Steam rose from a porcelain teapot. Beside it sat a plate of toast, eggs, and a small bowl of berries. "Eat," he said. His voice was rougher than last night, as if speaking hurt. Given the state of his jaw, it probably did. Harper stared at the food. Her mouth watered painfully, but she crossed her arms. "Is it poisoned?" Roman let out a short, breathy sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Yes. I went through the trouble of kidnapping you, bringing you to my home, and ordering my chef to prepare breakfast, all so I could slip arsenic into your Earl Grey. Just eat the food, Harper." She stiffened. "How do you know my name?" He looked at her, his expression flat. "You left your purse behind the counter at the diner. Your driver's license was inside." Harper Hayes. 24. No criminal record, surprisingly. You live in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner in the South End. Your brother Liam is 19 and attends the state college. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. Leave him out of this. I haven't brought him into it, Roman said, sitting gracefully on the edge of a grey velvet armchair. He gestured to the tray. I won't tell you again. Eat. Harper's pride fought a brief, violent war with her basic biology. Biology won. She stepped forward, ignoring the velvet chair opposite him, and sat cross-legged on the floor by the low table. She picked up a piece of dry toast and took a bite. It tasted like ash, but she forced herself to chew. Roman watched her. He didn't look away. It was that same mechanical, predatory stare from the diner. You hit hard, he noted quietly. You deserved it, she shot back around a mouthful of dry bread. Probably. He leaned back, resting his hands on his thighs. My men were going to shoot you. You know that, right? If I hadn't told Arthur to stop, your brain matter would be decorating the pie case. Then why did you stop him? Because, Roman said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Nobody has laid a hand on me in a decade. People nod, people smile, people cower. They agree with everything I say, even when I'm wrong. They hand me wet money from puddles. He tapped his injured jaw. You didn't. So I'm a novelty, Harper scoffed, pouring a cup of tea. Her bruised hand shook, rattling the porcelain. A shiny new toy because you're bored with your yes men. That's pathetic. Roman didn't flinch at the insult. Maybe. But you're also a problem. I can't have a waitress assaulting me in public and walking away. It sets a bad precedent. It makes me look weak. So you dragged me here to what? Torture me in private? No. Roman reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He tossed it onto the glass table. It landed next to the teapot with a heavy thud. I brought you here to hire you. Harper stopped chewing. She stared at the envelope, then up at him. You're insane. I need someone in my immediate circle who isn't terrified of me, Roman stated, his tone entirely businesslike. Someone who will tell me when I'm making a mistake. Someone who isn't blinded by the money or the guns. You looked down the barrel of Arthur's Glock, and you still told me to go to hell. That's a rare commodity. I'm a waitress. I drop plates and smell like grease. I don't know anything about whatever it is you do. I don't need you to run cargo, Harper. I need an assistant, a sounding board, a shadow. He tapped the envelope. There is $20,000 in there. Cash. That's your signing bonus. Your brother's tuition is covered. Your rent is covered. You work for me now. Harper looked at the envelope. $20,000. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was freedom from the crushing, suffocating weight of debt. It was a new apartment for Liam. It was sleep. It was blood money. She reached out. Roman's eyes tracked her hand, a faint glimmer of triumph sparking in his dead grey eyes. Everyone has a price. He had found hers. Harper picked up the envelope. It was thick, heavy. She looked Roman dead in the eye, and she dropped the envelope directly into the steaming pot of Earl Grey tea. The paper soaked instantly, turning translucent, the dark liquid seeping into the crisp bills inside. Roman froze. The triumph vanished, replaced by a shock so profound it left his face completely blank. I don't work for criminals, Harper said, her voice shaking, terrified of what she had just done, but unable to stop herself. And I don't want your money. Let me out. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft, bubbling hiss of the tea ruining $20,000. Roman stared at the teapot. Then, slowly, he raised his eyes to hers. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. The casual, detached curiosity was gone. In its place was something dark, volatile, and dangerously quiet. He stood up. Harper scrambled backward on her hands and feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a jackhammer. She hit the edge of the heavy wooden bed frame and scrambled up, putting the mattress between them. Roman didn't rush. He walked around the glass table, his eyes locked onto her face. He was terrifyingly graceful, moving with the slow, deliberate stalk of a predator cornering a wounded animal. "You think this is a game," Roman whispered. The gravel in his voice was sharper now. "Stay away from me," Harper warned, her eyes darting around the minimalist room. There were no weapons, nothing heavy enough to swing. Just a heavy crystal water carafe sitting on the nightstand. "You think you're brave," he continued, taking another slow step around the foot of the bed. "You think destroying my money proves a point. It doesn't. It just proves you're reckless." "I'm leaving," Harper said, her voice climbing an octave. She lunged for the nightstand, her fingers wrapping around the thick, cut crystal neck of the carafe. "Put it down, Harper." "Open the door," she screamed. She swung the heavy crystal jug violently against the edge of the bedside table. Crash! The carafe shattered. Water exploded across the wool rug, soaking into the fibers. Shards of thick crystal flew across the room, glittering under the ambient light. Harper gripped the remaining jagged neck of the carafe. Her knuckles were white. A thin line of blood welled up on her thumb, where a sharp edge bit into her skin. But she didn't feel it. She pointed the jagged glass toward him. "Open the damn door, or I swear to God I'll cut you." Roman stopped. They were less than 5 feet apart. He looked at the broken glass in her hand, the blood on her thumb, and the sheer, feral panic in her eyes. He didn't back away. He didn't call for Arthur. He stepped forward. Crunch! His expensive leather shoe came down on a large shard of crystal, grinding it into the floorboards. Harper's breath hitched. She thrust the makeshift weapon forward. "I mean it!" Roman took another step. The jagged edge of the glass was inches from his chest, right over his heart. He didn't even look at it. He looked at her face, watching the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her chest. "Do it," he challenged softly. Harper froze. Her hand trembled violently. The adrenaline demanded violence, but the fundamental human part of her, the part that patched up her brother's scraped knees and worked double shifts to survive, recoiled. She wasn't a killer. She was just a girl who was pushed too far. Roman saw the hesitation. In a fraction of a second, his hand darted out. He didn't strike her. He clamped his fingers around her wrist. His grip was absolute iron, warm and calloused, arresting her movement completely. Harper gasped, trying to yank her arm back, but it was like pulling against a concrete pillar. Roman stepped into her space, crowding her, forcing her to tilt her head up to look at him. He slowly, deliberately twisted her wrist, not enough to break it, but enough to force her fingers to open. The broken crystal neck slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor with a dull thud. Harper stopped fighting. She was trapped against the nightstand, Roman's body mere inches from hers. The smell of cedar, mint, and male heat surrounded her. She could feel the ambient heat radiating off his chest. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat. Roman didn't let go of her wrist. He looked down at her hand, his thumb lightly brushing the smear of blood on her skin where the glass had cut her. "You're shaking," he murmured. The anger was gone from his voice, replaced by a strange, heavy intensity. "Because I'm terrified of you," Harper breathed, refusing to look away, refusing to let him think she was weak, even as her body betrayed her. Roman's gaze snapped up to her eyes. The space between them felt charged, the air thick and electric. For a second, a flicker of something deeply conflicted crossed his face, a crack in the marble facade. He slowly released her wrist. He took a half-step back, giving her air. "Arthur will bring you bandages for your hand," Roman said, his voice flat once again, though his chest rose and fell a little faster than before. "And fresh clothes. You smell like old grease." He turned and walked toward the door, his shoes crunching softly over the broken crystal. "I'm not wearing anything you give me," Harper called out to his back, her voice shaking but defiant. Roman paused at the door. He didn't turn around. "Then freeze, little bird. The choice is yours." The heavy door clicked shut behind him, and the lock engaged. Arthur returned an hour later. He didn't knock. The heavy door swung open, and the massive bodyguard stepped inside, carrying a small, white plastic bin and a stack of folded fabric. He placed them silently on the unmade bed, his eyes lingering on the shattered crystal and the dark water stain soaking into the wool rug. He didn't say a word. He just turned and left, the lock engaging with that same final clack. Harper remained against the nightstand, her knees pulled to her chest until the sound of Arthur's heavy footsteps faded down the hall. Slowly, her muscles uncoiling with stiff, painful protests, she stood up. The adrenaline crash had left her feeling hollowed out, her limbs heavy and uncoordinated. She walked over to the bed. The white bin was a first aid kit. Beside it lay a pair of slate-grey sweatpants, a white t-shirt, and a thick, charcoal-coloured sweater. Harper reached out and touched the sweater. It was cashmere, impossibly soft, practically melting against her rough, work-chapped fingertips. The contrast between the fabric and her own skin made her stomach twist. It felt like a bribe, a quiet, tactile submission. She looked down at her diner uniform. The pink polyester polo was stiff with dried sweat and smelled faintly of rancid fryer oil. Her slip-resistant shoes were caked in mud and kitchen grime. She was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room and everything to do with shock. Pride told her to stay in the uniform. Pride told her to freeze before accepting anything from the man who had abducted her. But survival, the quiet, pragmatic voice that had kept her and Liam off the streets for the last 4 years, told her she couldn't think clearly if she was freezing. She stripped off the uniform, peeling the damp fabric away from her skin with a grimace. She tossed the clothes into a corner, a pathetic pile of pink and black. She opened the first aid kit. The sharp, chemical smell of iodine and rubbing alcohol cut through the stale air of the room. Harper sat on the edge of the mattress and inspected her right hand. The heel of her palm was a vivid, ugly canvas of purple and black from striking Roman's jaw. But it was her thumb that needed attention. The broken crystal had sliced a clean, deep line across the pad. She ripped open an alcohol wipe. She pressed it directly into the cut. The pain was blinding, a sharp, white-hot spike that made her gasp, her eyes watering instantly. She welcomed it. The sting grounded her, pulling her out of her spiraling panic and anchoring her back in her physical body. She wrapped a sterile bandage tightly around her thumb, using her teeth to tear the medical tape. Then she pulled on the clothes. They were too big, pooling around her ankles and hanging loosely off her shoulders, but the warmth was immediate and intoxicating. The cashmere felt heavy, a soft armor against the sterile chill of the room. She sat on the floor by the window, wrapping her arms around her knees, and watched the pines sway violently in the wind. The rain had picked up again, slashing against the tempered glass. Hours bled into one another. Harper dozed fitfully, her head resting against the cool glass, waking every time a floorboard creaked out in the hallway. It was late afternoon when the door unlocked again. Roman stepped in. He had changed into a dark suit, impeccably tailored, lacking a tie. The bruise on his jaw was now a deep, mottled plum, a violent splash of colour on his pale face. He looked at her, sitting by the window in his oversized clothes, and then glanced at the shattered glass still littering the floor. "I see you found the clothes," he said quietly. "They were either these or hypothermia," Harper replied, her voice raspy. She didn't stand up. She refused to give him the satisfaction of snapping to attention. Roman walked over to the armchair and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. "I made a phone call while you were sleeping." Harper's stomach plummeted. She went entirely still. "To Liam's college," Roman continued, his voice devoid of inflection. "The bursar's office. It's amazing what you can accomplish with a wire transfer and a polite tone of voice. His tuition for the next 4 semesters is paid in full, room and board included." The breath punched out of her lungs. "You didn't. I did." Roman reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He dropped it onto the floor between them. It was a printed receipt. "I also had a conversation with his landlord. The lease is renewed for 2 years. Paid." Harper stared at the piece of paper. It looked like a death warrant. "You think this traps me?" she whispered, looking up at him, her chest tight with a mixture of profound relief and suffocating dread. "You think buying my brother's life means you own mine." "I don't believe in owning people, Harper," Roman said, leaning back in the chair. "Ownership implies I have to maintain you like property. I prefer leverage. Leverage is a choice you make every morning when you wake up." "A choice?" She let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "What choice is that? Stay here and be your pet, or go to the police and watch my brother lose everything?" "You're not a pet." Roman's eyes darkened, the washed-out grey flinting with sudden intensity. "Pets are boring. They beg for scraps. They don't smash crystal carafes and threaten to gut me." He stood up, pacing slowly toward the window, stopping just a few feet from where she sat on the floor. He looked down at her. "I operate in a world where everyone lies to me, Harper. My accountants lie about margins. My rivals lie about truces. My own lieutenants lie about their loyalty. I am drowning in a sea of sycophants who are waiting for me to turn my back so they can slide a knife into it." He pointed a finger at his bruised jaw. "You gave me the absolute, unvarnished truth. You were tired, you were angry, and you hit me. No calculation. Just raw, unfiltered reality. I need that. I need someone in this house who isn't trying to manipulate me for a piece of my territory. So you kidnap me, isolate me, and force me into debt." Harper pushed herself up to her feet, matching his glare. "That's a hell of a way to build trust, Roman." "Trust is earned in the trenches," he said flatly. "I just threw you in the trench. Now we see if you can dig." He turned toward the door. "Dinner is in 20 minutes. Downstairs. Arthur will show you the way. Don't make me drag you." The dining room was a sprawling, cavernous space that felt more like a corporate boardroom than a place to eat. A massive mahogany table dominated the center, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the harsh, geometric chandelier hanging above it. Harper sat at the far end of the table, picking at a plate of roasted duck that tasted like wet cardboard in her dry mouth. She was acutely aware of Arthur standing like a stone sentinel by the double doors. Roman sat at the head of the table, 30 feet away, reading through a stack of thick, cream-colored files. He hadn't touched his food. He occasionally circled a number with a gold fountain pen, the scratching of the nib the only sound in the suffocating room. The heavy double door swung open, forcing Arthur to take a half step back. A man walked in. He was built like a middle linebacker, wearing a suit that cost more than Harper's apartment building. He had slicked back blonde hair and a face that was handsome in a cruel, sharp sort of way. He reeked of cheap cologne and stale cigarette smoke, a jarring intrusion into the sterile environment of the house. 2 other men trailed behind him, their hands casually resting near their waistbands. "Roman!" the blonde man barked, pulling out a chair halfway down the table and dropping into it without waiting for an invitation. "We have a situation at the docks." Roman didn't look up from his file. He slowly finished tracing a circle around a figure before capping his pen. "Declan, you're late." "Traffic," Declan dismissed, waving a hand. His eyes darted down the length of the table and locked onto Harper. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. "Well, well. Who's the stray? Didn't know you were taking in charity cases, boss." Harper stared back, her spine stiffening. Declan looked exactly like the sleazy shift managers she'd dealt with for years. Men who thought volume equaled authority. Men who confused cruelty with strength. "She is my new assistant," Roman said quietly. He placed his hands flat on the table. "And you will address her with respect." "What is the issue at the port?" Declan scoffed, leaning back and propping his expensive shoes onto an empty chair. "The Port Authority is squeezing us again. Inspector named Miller. He's holding up 3 containers from Naples. Says the paperwork is missing a stamp. Wants 50 grand to find the stamp." "Pay him," Roman said. "Pay him?" Declan's voice spiked, echoing off the high ceiling. "Are you kidding me? If we pay him, we look soft. We let him hold our freight hostage. Every inspector on the coast is going to line up for a payout." "The freight is worth 3 million, Roman replied, his voice maintaining that terrifying, dead-level calm. 50,000 is the cost of doing business. Pay him out of the slush fund." Declan slammed a hand on the table. The silverware rattled. "I say we send Arthur down there to break Miller's kneecaps. Remind him who runs the shipping lanes. You used to handle things, Roman. Lately you're just writing checks." Declan's eyes flicked to the massive purple bruise on Roman's jaw. The implication hung heavy in the air. "You're weak. You're getting hit and you're paying off bottom feeders." The tension in the room thickened into concrete. Arthur's hand drifted toward his coat. Declan's 2 men shifted their weight, their eyes locking onto Arthur. Harper watched the dynamic unfold, a sickening sense of familiarity washing over her. It was a pissing contest. She had seen it 100 times in the diner. 2 drunk guys squaring off over a spilled beer, each waiting for the other to back down, the situation escalating rapidly towards stupid, unnecessary violence. Only this time, the men had guns, and Harper was trapped in the crossfire. Roman remained perfectly still, but the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. He was calculating the cost of killing Declan right here in the dining room. Harper didn't think. She reacted. 50,000 is an operational expense, Harper said loudly, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. All 4 men snapped their heads toward her. Declan sneered. "Shut up, sweetheart. The adults are talking." Harper pushed her chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the slate floor. She stood up, her oversized cashmere sweater swallowing her frame. But she locked her eyes onto Declan with the same tired, blistering contempt she reserved for customers who snapped their fingers at her. "If you break Miller's kneecaps," Harper continued, walking slowly toward the center of the table, "he goes on medical leave. He gets replaced by a state-appointed supervisor. The state supervisor audits the port. That means all traffic stops for a minimum of 2 weeks. 2 weeks of zero movement on $3 million worth of cargo costs you a hell of a lot more than 50 grand. Declan blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden, logical barrage. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know how basic math works," Harper shot back, stopping just a few feet away from Declan. "And I know how bureaucracy works. You break a man, you create a victim. Victims attract cops. You pay a man, You create an accomplice. Accomplices keep their mouths shut because they're on the hook just as much as you are. She leaned forward, resting her knuckles on the polished mahogany. You want to play tough guy over 50 grand? Fine, but don't pretend it's good business. It's just a temper tantrum. Silence slammed back into the room. Declan stared at her, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. His jaw worked, trying to find words, but Harper had stripped away his argument in front of his men and his boss. Harper glanced at Roman. He was staring at her, his lips parted slightly. A look of profound, terrifying awe etched into his bruised face. Declan stood up abruptly, his chair toppling backward onto the floor with a loud crash. He pointed a thick finger at Roman. You're letting a waitress run your books now? You're losing your grip, Roman. The families are noticing. The meeting is over, Declan, Roman said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Declan spat on the immaculate floor, turned on his heel, and stormed out, his two musclemen trailing closely behind. The heavy double doors slammed shut. Harper stood by the table, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. She squeezed her eyes shut, hating herself. She had just defended a Mafia boss. She had just used her brain to optimize a criminal enterprise. She felt sick. Arthur, Roman said quietly. Clean up the floor. Roman stood up and walked slowly toward Harper. He stopped a foot away from her. The smell of cedar and mint washed over her, grounding her in the surreal moment. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a physical weight. Accomplices keep their mouths shut, Roman repeated softly, testing the words on his tongue. He tilted his head, studying her face, as if memorizing the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat. You continually surprise me, Harper Hayes. Don't! Harper choked out, wrapping her arms around her chest. Don't act like I did that for you. I just wanted him to leave before someone started shooting. Roman smiled, a genuine, terrifying curve of his lips that didn't reach his dead ice eyes. Whatever your reason, little bird, you just proved you belong here. Sleep was impossible. The rain had returned, a torrential downpour that battered the massive windows of the guest bedroom. The sound was usually comforting to Harper, a reminder of safety, while the world outside washed away. But tonight, it just sounded like static, masking whatever noise might be happening in the vast, empty halls of the brutalist house. It was 2 a.m., exactly 24 hours since Roman had walked into the diner and ruined her life. Harper paced the floorboards, her bare feet silent on the wood. The cashmere sweater felt suffocating now, a heavy reminder of her complicity at the dinner table. She had helped him. She had given him the playbook. A sharp, metallic sound cut through the noise of the storm. Harper froze. She recognized that sound. It was the heavy, industrial clack of a deadbolt sliding back, but it wasn't coming from her door. It was coming from down the hall. She pressed her ear against the cold wood of her bedroom door. The house was supposed to be a fortress, secured by Arthur and a dozen other men. But she heard a muffled curse, followed by a heavy, sickening thud that sounded distinctly like a body hitting the slate floor. Panic, cold and absolute, flooded her veins. "Declan," she breathed into the darkness. "You're losing your grip, Roman. The families are noticing." She stepped back from the door. Every instinct screamed at her to lock the deadbolt from the inside, to hide under the massive bed, to cover her ears and pray they forgot about the stray waitress in the guest room. But if Declan killed Roman, what happened to her? She was a witness. She had humiliated Declan in front of his men. If Roman died tonight, she wouldn't see the sunrise. Harper grabbed the heavy brass lamp off the nightstand, ripping the cord from the wall. The plug sparked in the dark. It was heavy, weighing at least 10 pounds. It was a pathetic weapon against guns, but it was all she had. She eased the door handle down. It clicked open. The hallway was pitch black. The ambient security lights had been cut. The smell of copper and ozone hung heavy in the air. Harper crept down the hall, keeping her back pressed flat against the wall. Her heart throbbed in her bruised right hand, a rhythmic, painful drumbeat. As she neared the grand staircase, a flash of blinding light illuminated the foyer below, followed immediately by the deafening roar of a gunshot. The sound bounced off the concrete walls, ringing in her ears, a physical blow to her equilibrium. Harper peeked over the glass balustrade. The foyer was a war zone. Arthur lay crumpled at the base of the stairs, a dark pool spreading rapidly beneath him. Two of Declan's men were moving slowly across the slate floor, their guns raised, sweeping the shadows. Roman was pinned behind a massive marble pillar near the front door. He held a sleek, black handgun, his breathing heavy and ragged, echoing in the brief silences between the thunder outside. He was trapped. The two men were flanking him, moving in absolute silence. Declan was nowhere to be seen, likely waiting outside until the dirty work was done. Roman leaned out to fire, but a bullet clipped the marble pillar inches from his face, sending razor-sharp shrapnel flying. Roman jerked back, gripping his left shoulder with a sharp hiss of pain. His gun clattered onto the slate floor, sliding out of his reach. He was disarmed, bleeding, a sitting duck. One of the gunmen stepped out from the shadows, raising his weapon, aiming directly at the center of Roman's chest. Harper didn't think. The same blind, desperate reflex that had driven her palm into Roman's jaw at the diner took over. She hefted the heavy brass lamp with both hands, aimed for the gunman standing directly below the balcony, and hurled it over the glass railing. The 10-pound hunk of metal plummeted downward. It struck the gunman squarely on the back of the neck with a sickening, wet crunch. He collapsed instantly, a marionette with its strings cut, his gun firing wildly into the ceiling as he went down. The second gunman whipped around, aiming up at the balcony. "Roman!" Harper screamed, throwing herself flat against the floorboards as a bullet shattered the glass balustrade above her head, showering her with tiny, biting shards of tempered glass. Roman didn't hesitate. The distraction was all he needed. He dove forward, sliding across the blood-slicked slate, and snatched his dropped weapon. He rolled up onto one knee and fired twice. The shots were deafening. The second gunman staggered backward, dropping his weapon, and fell heavily against the oak front door, sliding down to the floor, leaving a thick smear of red on the polished wood. Then silence. The absolute, ringing silence of a mausoleum. Harper lay trembling on the upstairs floorboard, her hands covering her head, gasping for air. Her lungs burned. She could hear the rain again, hammering against the roof, indifferent to the carnage inside. Harper. The voice was rough, pained, and directly below her. She crawled to the edge of the shattered balcony and looked down. Roman stood in the center of the foyer. His crisp white shirt was soaked in blood from his shoulder wound, clinging wetly to his chest. He held the gun loosely in his right hand. He was looking up at her, the harsh shadows of the foyer hiding his eyes, but his posture was rigid. He had seen what she did. He knew she had saved him. Slowly, carefully, Harper stood up. She brushed the broken glass off her cashmere sweater, her hands shaking so violently she could barely feel her fingers. She walked down the stairs, stepping carefully over Arthur, who was groaning softly, alive, but badly hurt. She stopped 3 feet away from Roman. The smell of cordite, blood, and burnt metal was suffocating. The reality of the violence was grotesque, devoid of the cinematic glamour television promised. It was just loud, messy, and smelled like butcher's meat. "You threw a lamp," Roman wheezed, pressing a hand tightly against his bleeding shoulder. A dark, twisted smile cracked across his pale face. A brass lamp. "It was heavy," Harper replied, her voice entirely flat, stripped of all emotion. She stared at the bodies on the floor. She had just aided and abetted a Mafia execution. The girl who served coffee and wiped down counters was dead. Roman stepped closer. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his fingers stained with gunpowder and his own blood, and gently tilted her chin up. "You could have stayed in the room," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her face. "You could have locked the door. If they killed me, you could have told the police you were a hostage. You would have walked away free." Harper met his gaze. The dead ice eyes were burning now, a manic, possessive fire that terrified her more than the guns. "If they killed you," Harper whispered, a tear finally breaking free and tracking hotly down her cheek. "Who was going to pay Liam's rent?" Roman stared at her, the smile fading into something profound, heavy, and infinitely more dangerous. He dropped his hand, letting it rest on the curve of her neck, his thumb pressing lightly against her erratic pulse. "I told you," Roman said, his voice a dark vow echoing in the bloody foyer. "Leverage is a choice you make every morning. Welcome to the firm, Harper." The storm raged outside, battering the glass, but inside the cold, concrete house, Harper Hayes realized she had just forged a chain that would drag her straight down to hell. And heaven help her. She was the one who locked the padlock. Blood dries a lot darker on imported slate than it does on cheap diner linoleum. Harper didn't just save a monster tonight. She secured her own place in his nightmare. Survival is rarely pretty. And sometimes the cost of keeping the people you love safe means selling your soul to the man whose jaw you broke. Will Harper lose herself entirely in Roman's violent empire, or will she become the one pulling his strings? If you loved this gritty dive into the underground, hit that like button, share with fellow dark romance addicts, and subscribe for more unapologetic stories.